The most shocking sexual practices of samurai raiders. When we think of the samurai, the image that usually comes to mind is one of honor, discipline, and martial excellence. These warriors, armed with razor-sharp katanas and bound by the strict code of Bushido, dominated Japan's battlefield for centuries. But hidden beneath the polished armor and stoic faces lies a history that few dare to explore, a world filled with dark, intimate secrets that challenge our modern understanding of sexuality, power, and tradition. This is the untold story of the most shocking sexual practices of the samurai raiders. Ancient Japan, sexuality was viewed through a different cultural lens. It wasn't bound by the rigid moral standards of modern Western society. In many ways, it was fluid, symbolic, and often deeply intertwined with social hierarchy and loyalty. Among the warrior elite, sex was more than physical pleasure. It was a tool for control, bonding, ritual, and sometimes domination. One of the most controversial aspects of samurai sexuality revolved around relationships between senior warriors and young male apprentices. These relationships were not secretive affairs. They were socially accepted under the practice known as wakashido, or the way of youth. Unlike modern concepts of same-sex relationships rooted in romantic love or identity, wakashido was primarily about mentorship, loyalty, and martial companionship. A seasoned samurai would take a teenage boy under his wing, not only to train him in swordsmanship and battlefield strategy, but also to engage in sexual relations as a form of spiritual and emotional bonding. These acts were considered honorable at the time, reflecting a deep level of trust and connection. However, in today's context, such practices would be rightly viewed as exploitative and abusive, especially given the imbalance of power and the young age of many of the participants. But within the rigid world of the samurai, this practice was so normalized that it was even recorded in poetry, art, and literature, often romanticizing the bond between master and disciple. Sexual dominance was also used to establish control and superiority, especially during warfare. Samurai raiders, after capturing enemies or invading villages, sometimes engaged in acts of sexual violence not only against women but also against male captives. This wasn't always about desire, it was a show of conquest and humiliation. Rape, in these cases, was a weapon, a method of asserting dominance over the defeated, regardless of gender. Historical records and folktales mention instances where victorious samurai would parade their captives naked through towns or force them into servitude, both sexual and physical. These actions were meant to degrade the conquered and elevate the status of the conqueror. In a society where honor was everything, being stripped of dignity in such a public and intimate way was one of the worst forms of humiliation. Another lesser-known but shocking practice was the keeping of war wives. These were often young boys chosen by high-ranking samurai to accompany them on military campaigns. Their duties included preparing armor, serving food, and offering companionship at night. Unlike traditional concubines, these boys had no formal status or protection. They were essentially sex slaves under the guise of servants, and their roles were often enforced through strict discipline and fear. In the samurai worldview, women were seen as bearers of children and caretakers of households, but not as equals in love or war. Many samurai viewed female sexuality with suspicion, associating it with weakness or distraction. Thus, relationships with young men were idealized because they were seen as pure, untainted by emotional dependency or social obligations. This led to a culture where female sexuality was suppressed, while male-to-male intimacy under very specific and controlled circumstances was encouraged. But this openness did not extend to all. While same-sex relationships between warriors were often tolerated, homosexuality among commoners or outside the warrior code was scorned. A farmer, merchant, or craftsman caught in such acts could face ridicule, punishment, or worse. This double standard reveals the class-based hypocrisy of the time. What was seen as noble among samurai was considered degenerate among the lower classes. Religious practices also played a role in shaping samurai sexual norms. Buddhism and Shintoism, the two dominant spiritual traditions in Japan, had complex and often contradictory views on sex. While Buddhist monks preached celibacy, many temples in feudal Japan were notorious for harboring secret sexual relationships between monks and acolytes. Some samurai, deeply influenced by Buddhist teachings, engaged in spiritual rituals that involved sexual acts believed to transfer energy or purify the soul. There are even legends of samurai engaging in group rituals where sexuality, swordplay, and chanting combined into bizarre rites of power. Though such stories are rare and often buried in myth, they hint at a hidden culture of erotic mysticism that thrived among elite warriors. In these secret circles, the line between violence, sex, and spirituality blurred in unsettling ways. As Japan began to modernize in the late 19th century, many of these practices disappeared or were deliberately erased from public memory. The Meiji Restoration sought to align Japan with Western moral values, and anything that didn't fit that new image of national identity was suppressed. Wakashido was condemned, homosexual relationships were criminalized, and the complex sexual culture of the samurai era was reduced to whispers and forgotten scrolls. Today, historians are rediscovering this hidden past, piecing together a more complete, albeit disturbing, portrait of samurai life. Through ancient documents, personal diaries, woodblock prints, and temple records, we now know that the samurai were not just warriors of honor and discipline but also human beings with desires, contradictions, and shadows. It's important to view this part of history with nuance. The practices discussed here should not be romanticized or excused, especially where coercion or abuse was involved. At the same time, we must resist the temptation to view the past solely through modern moral lenses. Cultures change, beliefs evolve, and what was once acceptable may now be unthinkable. But by understanding the full spectrum of samurai life, including its darker, more shocking aspects, we gain a more honest and complete view of history. The legacy of the samurai continues to inspire countless books, films, and video games. But the real samurai were far more complex than their modern portrayals. Beneath the surface of discipline and honor lay a world of contradictions where love and violence, loyalty and exploitation coexist in a delicate and often troubling balance. The sexual practices of samurai raiders were not just footnotes in history, they were a fundamental part of the culture, hierarchy, and identity of Japan's warrior elite. They reveal not only the private lives of those who shaped a nation, but also the uncomfortable truths about how power, sex, and tradition can become dangerously intertwined. If we truly want to understand the samurai, we must be willing to look beyond the sword, because history, in all its glory and horror, demands that we see the full picture even when it shocks us.